Welcome to another video. In the suffocating summer of 1856, deep in the rural expanse of Texas, there existed an event that slave owners simply called the race. It was not a competition. It was a scheduled massacre, bloody entertainment for wealthy men whose lives of luxury, built upon the suffering of others, had left them bored with existence. Once a year, during the 3 nights of the new moon, planters from across the South would converge on Blackwater Plantation. They came with their pockets full of gold and their souls empty of humanity. The rules were brutally simple. At 9 o'clock at night, 10 enslaved men were released into the swamp. At 9:15, the hunters set out after them, white men on horseback, armed with rifles and accompanied by packs of dogs trained to tear human flesh. The betting began weeks in advance. How long would the fastest one survive? How many bodies would be recovered by morning? Whose master owned the most resilient slave? In 7 years of existence, 70 black men had been thrown into that swampy hell. 70 men had died, shot, drowned, torn apart by dogs, or simply swallowed by the mud and the night. Their bodies fed the alligators. Their names were forgotten before dawn. No one had ever survived the Blackwater race. But in the 8th year, something changed. Among the 10 men chained in the yard of Blackwater Plantation that June night was one the other slaves called simply Abel. His back carried the scars of 200 lashes. His eyes had witnessed the sale of his wife and children to distant plantations. His hands knew only work and pain. But his mind had been busy for months, plotting something no slave owner could imagine. While the white men drank imported whiskey and counted stacks of gold coins by lantern light, while they adjusted their weapons and fed their dogs raw meat to awaken their hunger, Abel looked at the other 9 men beside him, and they all looked back, because they all knew that this night would be different. This night, the hunters would become the hunted. Before we continue with this shocking story, tell me, which city are you watching from? And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next stories. Let's continue. Blackwater Plantation sprawled across 3,000 acres of East Texas wilderness, where pine forests gave way to cypress swamps, and the land itself seemed to hold secrets in its dark waters. Colonel James Whitmore had inherited the property from his father, along with 147 human beings he considered livestock. But the colonel had grown tired of cotton and tobacco. He craved something more stimulating than profit margins. That's when he conceived the race. The first year, in 1849, it had been almost accidental. A drunken wager between Whitmore and 3 neighboring planters about whose slaves could run fastest through the swamp. By the 2nd year, word had spread. Wealthy men arrived from as far as Charleston and New Orleans, bringing their finest horses, their deadliest weapons, and their most disposable property. The event became legend in the shadowy world of the plantation elite, whispered about in gentlemen's clubs, but never mentioned in polite society. The swamp itself was perfect for the purpose. 2 miles deep and 3 miles wide, it was a labyrinth of black water, cypress knees, quicksand pits, and predators, both reptilian and insect. A man could disappear there and never be found. Many had. But while Colonel Whitmore thought he controlled every aspect of his twisted game, he had made one critical miscalculation. He believed the men he sent into that swamp were broken, defeated, too terrified and exhausted to think beyond their own survival. He never imagined they could plan. He never considered they might communicate. He never dreamed they could organize. And he certainly never suspected that his own house slaves, the ones he trusted to serve his meals and shine his boots, were part of the conspiracy. The architect, 3 months before the 8th annual race, Abel had been sold to Blackwater Plantation for $8,000. A bargain, Whitmore thought, for a prime field hand. What the colonel didn't know was that Abel's reputation as a troublemaker, which had lowered his value, was earned. He had attempted escape twice before at his previous plantation in Louisiana. He had been caught both times and punished with 100 lashes each time, the scars crisscrossing his back like a brutal map of resistance. But during those failed attempts, Abel had learned something more valuable than freedom. He had learned patience. He had learned to watch, to listen, to gather information while appearing defeated. And most importantly, he had learned that freedom achieved alone was no freedom at all. On his third day at Blackwater, while working in the cotton fields, Abel heard two overseers discussing the race. They spoke casually, laughing about the previous year's event, about how the betting pool had reached 20 years Allozen, and how one man had made it almost a mile before the dogs caught him. Abel said nothing, but his mind was racing. That evening in the slave quarters, he listened. He learned names and relationships: Samuel, the blacksmith; Moses, who tended the horses; Isaiah, who had been at Blackwater for 15 years; Caleb, young and strong; Ruth, a house slave who could read and write, a skill she kept carefully hidden. He watched them all, establishing himself as quiet and compliant, never drawing attention. Invisibility was a kind of freedom, the freedom to plan. It was Ruth who approached him first, on a moonless night 2 weeks after his arrival. "You're planning something," she whispered. It wasn't a question. Abel remained still, unsure if this was a trap. But Ruth continued, her voice burning with hatred. "I've been here 6 years. I've seen 3 races. I've seen 30 men go into that swamp. One of them was my brother. He was 16. Abel studied her, then nodded once. Ruth spoke quickly. "The colonel keeps his guns in a cabinet in his study. 6 rifles, 4 pistols. The key hangs behind his desk. After dinner, he drinks himself stupid. The overseers play cards until midnight. There are 12 dogs, but only one handler sleeps nearby, and he's deaf in one ear." Hope stirred in Abel's chest. Dangerous, treacherous hope. "How many others know?" he asked quietly. "Samuel knows. Moses knows. Isaiah's been talking about it for years. Maybe 10 or 12 people total who would help if they thought there was a real chance. We've been waiting for someone like you." There's the conspiracy. Over the following weeks, the conspiracy took shape. Samuel, the blacksmith, began setting aside scrap iron, shaping it secretly into crude but effective weapons: blades, spikes, lengths of chain. He worked slowly, hiding his creations in 3 separate locations around the property. Moses studied the horses and mapped the swamp entrances, identifying which paths led to quicksand and which were relatively safe. Isaiah, despite his age, recounted every detail of the previous 7 races. The hunters' formations, the dog's release point, the colonel's position on his raised platform. Ruth continued to serve in the main house, learning that this year's race was scheduled for June 15th, 16th, and 17th during the new moon. Invitations had been sent to planters across 5 states. But most crucially, Ruth learned something the colonel had mentioned casually over dinner. This year, for the first time, he planned to allow the selected slaves to spend the afternoon before the race unchained, to let them build up hope before crushing it in the swamp. When Ruth reported this, Abel smiled, not with joy, but with the cold satisfaction of a man who had just been handed the key to his enemy's destruction. "That's when we move," he said. The plan was audacious. They would not try to escape during the race, which is what everyone expected. They would not run blindly into the swamp. Instead, they would turn the event inside out, using the chaos and darkness to their advantage, striking back with a violence that would echo across generations. Abel approached each man selected for the race personally. Caleb was first. "You've been selected," Abel told him. "You understand what that means. You got maybe one chance in 100 of seeing sunrise. Most men don't last 2 hours. Is that the death you want? Caleb nodded slowly. I'd rather die fighting. He found similar resolve in the others. Thomas, whose wife had been sold to pay the colonel's gambling debts. Benjamin, whose hands bore scars from holding hot coals as punishment. Elijah, whose son had been beaten to death at age 12 for stealing an apple. Each man had a story written in scars and loss. Each man was ready. By late May, they had 10 men committed to the plan. They had weapons hidden. They had detailed knowledge of the swamp. They had Ruth and 3 other house slaves ready to help from inside. They had Moses ready to scatter the horses. They had Samuel ready to break into the ammunition storage. What they didn't have was any guarantee. A single betrayal would doom them all. Abel lay awake at night reviewing every detail, the weight of responsibility pressing on him like a physical thing. But if they succeeded, they would prove that enslaved people could fight back, could organize and defeat their oppressors despite overwhelming odds. On June 1st, Colonel Whitmore made his official selections. He called out 10 names: Abel, Caleb, Thomas, Benjamin, Elijah, Marcus, Joseph, and 3 others who were not part of the conspiracy: Simon, David, and Jacob. Abel's heart sank. 3 men who knew nothing. 3 men who could ruin everything. That evening, he approached them separately, taking an enormous risk. He told them everything. Simon listened carefully, then asked, "You really think we can kill them all?" Abel answered honestly, "No. I think some of us will die, maybe most of us. But I'd rather die trying to take them with me than die running." Simon extended his hand. "I'm in." David was harder to convince, worn down by years of brutality. But finally, he nodded. "I've got nothing left to lose." Jacob was the biggest risk. Young, scared, still hoping compliance might earn mercy. But he was also angry, still raw from being torn from his mother. Tears rolled down his face, but his jaw was set. "What do I have to do?" They were 13. The hunt. The final 2 weeks passed in agonizing slowness. Carriages arrived daily, bringing wealthy men from across the South. They came with servants, with hunting dogs, with expensive rifles. The smell of roasting meat and tobacco smoke hung over the property. At night, lantern light spilled from the main house windows as the guests drank and gambled and told stories about previous hunts. Ruth reported the names: Richard Beaumont from New Orleans, worth over 200 zallos, and Henry Caldwell from Alabama, who owned 600 slaves, William Preston from Georgia, Thomas Ashford from Mississippi, who had brought 12 dogs, Jonathan Reed from South Carolina, a slave trader who had personally auctioned over 15,000 human beings. These were the wealthiest, most powerful members of Southern society. They saw no contradiction in attending church on Sunday and betting on human suffering on Saturday. The betting pool reached 52,000, more money than any slave would see in 10 lifetimes, all wagered on human suffering. On the morning of June 15th, the selected 13 were taken to a holding pen near the swamp's edge. As promised, they were kept unchained. They were given extra food, a mockery of kindness designed to give them energy for running. Abel used the time to review the plan one final time, speaking in voices too low for the overseers to hear. The critical moment comes 30 minutes after we're released. He told them. They'll be confident, their guard down. We won't be running away. We'll be circling back, positioning ourselves for ambush. They think we're animals. They think we'll panic. So we give them the opposite. We move slow and careful. We use everything we know. And when they come into our territory, we take them apart one by one. As darkness fell, the guests assembled near the starting point. Dozens of lanterns illuminated the scene. The dogs strained at their leashes. The hunters checked their weapons. The colonel stood on his raised platform, whiskey, soaked pride in his voice. "Welcome to the 8th annual Blackwater race. The prey will be released at 900 sharp. The hunt begins at 9:15. May we all enjoy a profitable evening." The crowd cheered. Money changed hands. The 13 men were led to the starting line. Abel looked back at the assembled white men, memorizing every detail. In a few hours, some of those faces would be gone forever. The colonel raised a pistol and fired into the sky. The race had begun. The turning, the 13 men sprinted into the darkness. Behind them, the crowd roared. But Abel led them deeper into the swamp at a controlled pace, preserving energy. 200 yards, then we split. He called back. At exactly 19:15, they heard the second gunshot. The hunters were coming. Now, Abel hissed. The group split into 4 units as planned. Abel's group circled toward the eastern edge, where Samuel had hidden weapons. They moved through water up to their thighs, cold and black. Behind them, the sounds of the hunt moved in the wrong direction. The hunters, following the obvious trail deeper, into the swamp. "They think we're running straight," Caleb whispered. "Good," Abel replied. They reached the cache and found 3 iron blades wrapped in oilcloth. Abel took one, feeling its weight. They crouched in the shadows, water lapping at their chests, and waited. The first hunter appeared 23 minutes later, moving alone through the darkness. He was young, carrying a rifle that probably cost more than Abel's sale price, moving carelessly, convinced of his own safety. He never saw Abel rise from the water. The iron blade went into his back between the ribs. They pulled him under, holding him down until he was still. 1. They moved on. From different parts of the swamp came sounds of violence, a dog yelping, men shouting in alarm, gunshots. The other groups were engaging. The second hunter was older, more careful, but he carried a lantern. A tactical error that destroyed his night vision while advertising his position. Simon rose behind him silently and brought a heavy branch down on his skull. 2. They reached the western edge and found Moses waiting with Thomas and Benjamin. Between them lay 3 dead hunters and 2 dead dogs. "The horses?" Abel asked. "Scattered them like we planned," Moses replied. "Poor chaos." "How many total?" Thomas asked. "At least 7. But they're starting to realize something's wrong. I heard them trying to regroup near the center. Then we hit them while they're grouped." Abel decided. "All of us together." They moved through the darkness toward the sounds of frightened voices. The hunters had gathered in a clearing. Perhaps 15 of them, lanterns raised, guns pointed at shadows. They were afraid now, the realization dawning that something had gone terribly wrong. Abel's group circled around them, joined by the others emerging from the north. 13 slaves, armed with stolen guns, crude blades, and clubs. 13 men who had nothing left to lose. They attacked from 4 directions simultaneously. The gunfire was deafening. Men screamed. Lanterns shattered. In the chaos, hunters shot at each other as often as at the slaves. Abel saw Jonathan Reed, the slave trader, trying to reload his rifle with trembling hands. Abel's blade opened his throat. 15,000 lives ended with one stroke. The fight lasted perhaps 4 minutes. When it was over, 12 more hunters lay dead or dying. The remaining few fled into the darkness, running in blind panic like the prey they had come to hunt. But the slaves had lost Benjamin and David. 11 remained. "Back to the plantation," Abel ordered, "before they can regroup. Asser's the reckoning." When they emerged from the swamp, covered in mud and blood, they found the plantation in complete disarray. Guests who hadn't entered the swamp were gathering their belongings in panic. Servants ran frantically. The colonel stood on his raised platform, trying to organize a defense, his face purple with rage and terror. "What are you doing?" he screamed.
"They're just slaves. We have guns."
He never finished the sentence. Moses shot him from 30 feet away. The colonel fell backward off the platform, landing in the dirt with his skull shattered. What followed was not a battle but an execution. The slaves had surprise, desperation, and the support of over 100 other enslaved people, who now saw their chance. The white men had panic and the fatal arrogance of people who had never truly believed the enslaved could fight back. Ruth and the other house slaves joined in, using knives from the kitchen. Samuel opened the weapons cabinet, distributing rifles. The plantation slaves rose up with a fury that had been building across generations. By midnight, it was finished. 34 white men lay dead. The guests from Louisiana, Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, South Carolina, all the wealthy plantation owners who had come for entertainment. The main house was burning, flames climbing into the night sky. The stables were burning. The cotton storehouse was burning. In the colonel's study, before the flames consumed it, they found the leather bags containing 52,000. Abel stared at the money for a long moment, all that gold representing bets on human suffering. Then he picked up a bag and hurled it into the fire. "We're not thieves. We're free people." The others followed his example without hesitation. The 52,000 burned to ash. As dawn approached, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink, the survivors gathered in the yard. 143 people, no longer property, no longer slaves, stood together as the sun rose on a new day. They took what supplies they could carry and left in small groups, all ultimately heading toward Mexico and freedom. The Blackwater race never happened again. The property was eventually seized by the state, but no one wanted it. The legend of what happened there made it cursed ground. In slave quarters across the South, people spoke in whispers about Abel, and the night the hunters became the hunted. Abel and his companions reached Mexico 7 weeks later, after fighting through pursuit by bounty hunters and militia. Most survived to build new lives. Some returned years later, after the Civil War, to search for families. Some disappeared into history, their names forgotten but their actions remembered. The Blackwater Massacre killed 34 white men and freed 143 black souls. The financial loss exceeded 300,000, but the psychological impact was incalculable. A crack in the foundation of slavery itself, proof that the system could be broken by those it sought to crush. And somewhere in Mexico, Abel built a quiet life, never forgetting that freedom is not given but taken, paid for in blood and fire, and the absolute refusal to accept bondage as fate. Thanks for watching.